My name is Rebecca Christie. I'm a non-resident fellow here at Bruegel, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the academic lecture at this year's Bruegel annual meetings. We welcome those of you in the room and those of you online to hear from Professor Ricardo Hausmann. He is the founder and director of Harvard's Growth Lab, and he is professor of the practice of international political economy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He was the very first chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank and was Minister of Planning in Venezuela, among many, many other achievements throughout his career. We're very pleased to have him here to give a bit of a talk on green development and whether it is an oxymoron. Professor, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
So we will hear from Ricardo and then possibly have a little bit of time for questions and answers. We have about 45 minutes. If you are online or in the room and want to ask a question online, the Slido code is BAM green, and we may have some time to take questions from the room. And with that, looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with us. I wish I could have done it in person. It would have been really cool. My mother was born in Brussels, so it always makes me remember her. I am, I talk to a lot of governments in the developing world and emerging markets and transition countries, and I understand that young people and everybody are excited about the green agenda, the challenge that society faces to stop climate change, to achieve net zero by a certain date, and the moral imperative that we as a human race have in these challenges. But if you talk to a finance minister, a minister of economy, I mean, you can start with that spiel, but you lose their attention very quickly because they have really important issues on their plate. They have jobs problems, maybe inflation. The fiscal accounts are hard to balance. Investment may be tanking. Interest rates are high. Funding the government is a challenge. I mean, and then you're talking about global emissions. Well, it just so happens that, they represent, even the largest of the countries in the emerging transition world represent less than 1% of global emissions. So even if they were to achieve net zero by tomorrow, which no one is expecting, that's going to do nothing for climate change. And while everything that happens to the climate is going to hit them full force, so if you are 0.5% of global emissions, to first approximation, you're going to get 99.5% of the impacts of climate change, even if you eliminated 100% of your emissions. So it's just an extreme version of the common pool problem, right? In fact, it's commendable that the European Union has this political commitment, because the European Union is about 8% of global emissions. And if you stopped all European global emissions, you'll have 92% of the problem left. So I think that framing things in that way is somewhat unconstructive. You're not going to get much attention. Now, it is very important that the European Union continue leading the effort of making the world decarbonize, not just the European Union decarbonize, because as I just said, European Union decarbonizing is 8% of the problem. But having the world decarbonize. And if you frame it in the following way of saying, look, the global economy is going to be changing. The global economy is going to be achieving net zero. In the process of that transformation of the global economy, markets are going to change. Needs are going to change. What countries are going to be needing to buy is going to change. What countries are going to be willing to buy is going to change. And as a consequence, your country is going to be hit by markets that are shrinking, But there's going to be a bunch of markets that are growing enormously, providing the goods that are going to make the world decarbonize. So in my mind, the right framing of the question is not, let's go to each country and ask each country to reduce its emissions. Those emissions are minuscule, and you're not going to pay attention to the countries that are very small because, why are you going to waste time in them? Work on India, work on China, work on the US, work on the big emitters. But for most countries of the world, the important frame in my mind is for themselves to carve a role in helping the world decarbonize, not in helping themselves decarbonize, in helping the world decarbonize. In the end, the market is a place where we earn a living by doing things for other people. That's what the market is. The Pope didn't get it. He finds that the market is immoral, but really, in the market economy, you make things. You earn a living by doing things that other people find valuable, and how much you earn depends on how valuable other people think is the stuff you did for them. And if the world wants to decarbonize, then maybe your country can play a role in providing the goods, the services, the inputs that will allow the world to decarbonize. And that may be your source of growth and your source of comparative advantage going forward. So I'm going to mention very quickly 8 themes that I think that authorities in emerging markets and transition countries and developing countries, frontier countries should put at the top of their economic strategy. The first one, I would call it, get yourself in the electrification bandwagon. We think we understand that about 40% of global emissions have to do with the creation of energy. And if we're going to decarbonize, we will want energy systems to move towards electricity and then to generate that electricity in clean ways. Well, that's going to hit many countries, positively and negatively. I come from Venezuela. We supposedly have their largest oil reserves in the world. As Sheikh Yamani, famously said, the Stone Age didn't end because the world ran out of stones, and the oil age is not going to end because the world ran out of oil. Hopefully, most of that oil will remain on the ground, and that means that countries that thought that they had an asset that was going to be valuable, etc., maybe that asset is not going to be as valuable. Countries like Colombia, the bulk of their exports are oil and coal. They have to think that that's probably not going to be their future. What is going to be their future? But on the other hand, electrification requires a lot of solar panels. It requires a lot of wind farms. It requires a lot of cables. It will probably require electrolyzers, capacitors. There's a whole electrification process that's going to be intensive in a bunch of capital goods that are highly intensive in minerals. And obviously lithium for lithium batteries, cobalt, copper, aluminum, nickel, the list goes on and on. If the world is going to decarbonize, there has to be a mining boom. Now, mining is a complicated industry. It's an industry that has local impact. That not in my backyard arguments. It's an industry that itself is energy intensive, and you would want to have those minerals be produced with clean energy, so that maybe if Europe is going to tax products and based on their carbon content, you don't have to pay that tax. So, and maybe those. By the way, mining is very intensive in water, and there's big conflicts on water use. that you need to solve. And, the Chileans have solved many of them by desalination and so on, by producing their own water for the mining companies that have lowered some tensions, but not everywhere. So it is very hard to maintain a political agreement that supports or even just tolerates mining. But mining is an incredible opportunity for many countries out there, and the world really needs this mining boom to be able to sustain the electrification process that underpins the road to net zero. So this is, I think, one major topic, one major theme. By the way, Australia produces more minerals than Africa. And that's not because the endowment of Australia is bigger than the endowment of Africa in minerals. It's mainly because Australia has better institutions that have figured out how to host these mining investments. So I think that this is a big topic. Unfortunately, the environmental movement for a very long time, campaigned and organized against the mining industry. So the idea that all these minerals are in some sense green and there's such thing as green mining, people find it contradictory. But the truth is that, now that you have a lot of these activists of the environmental movement in positions of power in countries like Peru and Chile, which are major mining exporters, it means that they have, complicated the investment climate for investments in mining, and mining investments in both Peru and Chile are going down, not up, when the world actually needs them to be going up significantly. So that's the first theme. Ask countries not what are their commitments to lower their emissions, ask them also what are their commitments to help the world lower its emissions, to create the wherewithal for the rest of the world to lower its emissions. So that's, I would say, theme number one. Theme number two is a little bit more subtle, and I don't know that people have focused on it yet. As you know, if you divide the world in major regions, Europe is the region of the world with the biggest energy deficit. And that's one of the reasons why Europe right now is in an energy security crisis. Because, the US is more or less balanced. China has a lot of internal energy and so on. They have a deficit, but not as large as Europe. Europe is sort of like the big energy deficit. And there's one aspect of oil that the world didn't focus too much on. And that is that oil is exquisitely energetic in the sense that per unit of weight and volume, it is amazingly dense. Per unit of weight, hydrogen is even denser than oil, but a kilogram of hydrogen occupies a very, very large space. And if you don't want it to occupy that large space, you will have to compress it or liquefy it, and that will take you a hell of a lot of energy to achieve that. So hydrogen is not as easy as energy dense as oil. Natural gas, by the way, is not as energy dense as oil. And that means that it's harder to transport. So if you have, a barrel of oil next to the oil well where it came out at $100, say, and you want to move it to the other half of the world. So, in a circle, you can only the maximum distance is half the distance to the other side. Well, it will cost you at most $5. So, if you have energy here, oil here at 100, at the most distant place, it will not cost more than 105. That means that thanks to oil, the world became energetically flat, in the sense that energy-intensive products could be made in energy-poor countries. In other words, since we are speaking in Brussels, Belgium can be an exporter of steel. Japan can be an exporter of steel. China can be an exporter of steel. This is like in Norway being an exporter of pineapples. Okay. That only happens because oil is very, very cheap to transport. But renewable energy is not cheap to transport. It's very expensive to transport. If you generate a megawatt hour of energy with the sun, when the sun shines, okay, today there are many places in the world that pay less than $20 per megawatt hour. Keep that now, $20 per megawatt hour. Today, that is less than the cost of the oil or the natural gas that you would have used or the coal that you would have used to generate, a megawatt hour of energy, not even counting the cost of transforming that oil by using a plant. So it became amazingly cheap. But if you want to use that megawatt hour at night, you would have to put it, say, in a lithium battery, or you would have to transform it into hydrogen and then use the hydrogen back to generate electricity. Well, if you use that same megawatt hour at night, it no longer costs $20. It will cost something like $180. If you want to put that energy into hydrogen, put that hydrogen into ammonia, and then export the ammonia, well, it will cost you something like $150 or $160. So the world is going to not be energetically flat anymore. And as a consequence, energy-intensive industries will want to locate in places that are close to green energy, because it will be very costly to transport green energy. So instead of Europe asking itself, how am I going to bring all this energy to Europe? It should be asking itself, what are the industries that I should try to locate in places that will have access to cheaper sources of renewable energy? Okay, because that's where they're going to be competitive. And that opens up a huge opportunity for the countries that are rich in green energy. And that can become the growth strategy for many countries. How can we harness these green energy resources and use them locally to do energy intensive products that would save us on the attempt to transport that energy to other parts. So I think that that's another important investment theme. A third important investment theme is the following. The sun shines, water falls, and the wind blows for free. They blow for free. You don't have to pay the sun for when it shines. So in some sense, the inputs of these alternative energy sources are all free. So when you look at the cost structure of these industries, it's mostly fixed cost. There's very little variable cost and there's very little input cost. You have the cost of the capital equipment and very little else, right? So when you ask yourself the question, what is the cost? How, who's going to be cost competitive in these things? Well, obviously, you have to have access to cheap capital goods, etc. You have to be able to install them efficiently, so you have to have an effective construction industry. But a critical element is, what is your cost of capital? What is your cost of capital? And while the sun shines a lot in the tropics, capital markets tend to shun the tropics. So, for example, if you can finance a solar energy plant in Germany, maybe at, 2% a year, it will cost you probably 7 to 8% per year in the Dominican Republic. And so while the sun shines more strongly and more often in the Dominican Republic than in Germany, When you work out the costs, the capital cost advantage can be very significant. So if you're talking to a developing country Ministry of Finance and so on, working on the cost of capital, trying to become investment grade, trying to create not only security over the stability of the country's balance of payments, security over the stability of the country's fiscal accounts, security of the general rule of law. You'll also need to work on the soundness of the framework for investment in all of these green industries. And many countries stumble into that. For example, Bolivia supposedly has the largest lithium reserves in the world. About a decade ago, they decided on a nationalist lithium development strategy that has made sure that not a ton of lithium has been exported from Bolivia, even though next door Chile is enjoying a boom in lithium exports. So capital will shun places that don't have the right framework, both a macroeconomic framework that is going to set a floor to capital costs, but a bunch of other policy risks that are going to affect industry-specific capital costs. So keep your capital costs down. If you thought that macro stability and so on, the kinds of things that macroeconomists like to impress on countries, that's going to become competitively more important going forward because of the structure of the costs of many of the things that are going to be required to achieve net zero. A fourth topic I would mention is that the world has always had technological uncertainty, but that this movement to green zero sort of enhances technological uncertainty. You can have two attitudes. One is, you can pray that the technological uncertainties don't particularly hit your country, or you can manage those risks. And I think it's very important that countries be aware of the technological risks that are coming down the pike, whether they're going to hit them on the positive side. Maybe, there's going to be a huge demand for, say, lithium because the EV is going to be, the transportation solution of the future, and it's going to be, lithium-ion batteries and so on. So you'll be, positively impacted by that. Or maybe, the solution is not going to be electric vehicles, but vehicles that run on hydrogen and use fuel cells, or that the batteries are not going to be made out of lithium, but out of fluor iron, and which apparently, can contain more energy per unit of weight, etc. And so there's a technological race. You don't know what the outcome of that technological race is, but you want to know what are the risks involved if you're going to be, making a major development, say in lithium, and you don't know if fluor or fuel cells end up winning that technological race. So you'll have to manage those risks, but in order to manage them, you have to be aware of them. And to be aware of them, you need to do technological surveillance. And some countries do technological surveillance, many don't. Israel and Singapore have a chief economist working in the Ministry of, a chief scientist working in the Ministries of Economy. And they do that. They do technological surveillance, and they try to figure out, given what's happening in the technological front, what's likely to happen in my country. What are the opportunities? What are the risks? What are the potential investments? So I would say that countries need to do much more technological surveillance than what they are currently doing. I think that there are other things that countries can be doing. The world probably is going to achieve net zero, not because gross emissions are going to be zero, but because carbon is going to be captured. So, the world will need to develop markets for carbon sinks. And what are those markets going to be like, and how far have we moved in that direction? Well, I've been doing some work on the deforestation of the Amazon. And if you look at the economics of deforestation, say in a country like Colombia, it's very simple. Nobody makes money out of the forest. if you cut the forest and you put cattle there, you probably need 2 hectares of land per cow. So, you know, every hectare is about half a cow, but cows take like 4 years to grow. So say every hectare is like an eighth of a cow in steady state. So, you know, an eighth of a cow per hectare is more than 0. But, you know, a hectare of land captures a lot of hydrogen, a lot of carbon, and if that carbon is adequately priced, like if it is priced at the current price of carbon in Europe, you know, capturing carbon in the Amazon is more profitable than cattle ranching. But the going price in Colombia for a carbon credit is about 1/10 of the price in Europe. And as a consequence, you know, cattle ranching is better than leaving the forest be. If we want to change that, we need to develop these carbon credits, and we need to develop the markets for carbon sinks. And you need to make sure that somehow these credits that, say, Colombia is issuing are tradable, and that, you know, a European company can buy them and trust in their worth, and that, you know, in the end, you know, a carbon atom is a carbon atom, whether it's Colombian or Belgian, and in principle, they should go for the same price. They don't go for the same price because they may not be equally credible. So you need to work on the institutions that will allow you to develop a carbon sink industry. Another example is, you know, carbon capture and sequestration. Most countries don't know what geological formations they have that they could use for carbon sequestration. They have a legislation that was designed to make sure that when people try to take stuff out of the ground, that they pay their royalties and they have a tax regime and whatever. So taking valuable things out of the ground is something that the legislation has thought about. What's the legislation to put, say, residues into the ground? You know, that's not in anybody's policy framework. And they don't know, you know, where are going to be the CO2 that people are going to be capturing, and where are the destinations that they're going to be looking for that are relatively nearby to sequester that carbon. That's an industry that's, you know, potentially could develop, but it may coincide with a lot of places where there's a lot of oil and industries that you'll be abandoning, that you might want to move, you know, the employment in those regions, you know, the use of those underground assets in a new direction. But you'll have to work on it if you want to make money out of that possibility. You're also going to face, you know, adaptation risks. You know, in many countries that I work on, I'm remembering now, we did a study on Sri Lanka, and we did, say, a growth diagnostic of Sri Lanka and macro risks of Sri Lanka and everything about Sri Lanka. But then we decided to do a diagnostic of some of the regions of Sri Lanka. And in the North Central province, what we found is that the biggest risk is climate change, because rain is falling precipitously, and this used to be the rice basket of Sri Lanka. So you are going to be hit by changing weather patterns. You better know very well what you expect to happen in your country. For example, I'm very glad that the government of Albania has decided to create a dam in Skavica, because it allows to control the water of a river that is bound to get probably a little bit less rain on average, but much more concentrated, and it's likely to generate massive floods in the future. So instead of having floods, if you can have green energy, sounds like a potentially good deal, and they're moving in that direction. But that involves some thinking about adaptation and using the risks of adaptation in the best possible way. The other thing I think is important for countries is to don't misunderstand David Ricardo. He was not my great-grandfather, but David Ricardo might have said, there's some gains from Britain exporting textiles and Portugal exporting wine. And those, gains from static comparative advantage are great. But to tell countries, don't do things you don't know how to do because you're not good at them. Focus on the things you're good at them and trade. That's a very, very wrong message. With that message, you would have told France to focus on wine and cheese because they're very good at wine and cheese. They would never have gotten to high-speed rail or to Airbus with those recommendations. The technologies of the future, nobody knows how to make them well. But there will be some countries that learn and other countries that don't. And the question is, if your country is going to be one that learns, and what is it going to learn? What learning process it's going to get into so that at the end of the process, it develops a comparative advantage it today doesn't have. Countries grow not because they focus on their areas of comparative advantage, but because they evolve their areas of comparative advantage. They change the things in which they're good at. And I think that countries need to decide on what challenges, what learning challenges they need to absorb. So I don't think that green growth is an oxymoron. I think green growth is a real possibility, but it has to be framed correctly. It cannot be framed as, you used to have trouble growing, but now we want you to grow without emitting. Yeah. So as my father likes to say, why make things difficult if you can make them impossible? So framed that way, it's just saying, the possibilities of growth that were already difficult for you, now we're going to make them harder for you because you have to abandon a set of options that might have been cheaper. And consequently, and you have to do it because of this moral responsibility to humanity, et cetera, even though you know that if you were to fully succeed, it won't change humanity's predicament. But if the issue is, it is a global problem, let me see how my country can help the world decarbonize, and we are going to earn a living by helping the world decarbonize, by providing the goods that the world will need to decarbonize, because we're going to produce them by leveraging our resources, leveraging our knowledge, leveraging our capabilities, leveraging our legal frameworks, leveraging our economic ecosystem so that we can help the world decarbonize. Then green growth becomes probably the best strategy going forward. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'd like to collect a few questions, but if I may, as the moderator, ask the first one. I'd like to ask how your philosophy for aligning the economic interests of creditor countries and developing countries, and the thing I liked about it was it maintained the agency of the developing countries, but how you do that within the framework of conditionality that comes with so much of the international lending, particularly the subsidized lending.
Well, I think that conditionality is very often a super destructive element. My friend Len Pritchett has a phrase that I find brilliant, really brilliant. And he says that you cannot make Pinocchio into a child by adding a few more strings to it. That is the idea that, you have to impose this conditionality for Pinocchio to be a real child, because otherwise Pinocchio is not going to do things. So, and this conditionality is sort of like the strings you put for Pinocchio to move like a child. Well, unless these things are internalized and are the kinds of things that Pinocchio wants to do, not because there's some strings attached, but because it comes from himself, then Pinocchio is not going to become a child. So it's I have worked on countries. I don't know that I should mention their name, but I have a very particular country in my mind that is aid dependent, and they know they're aid dependent, and they might have, at one point in time thought about a growth strategy, but one day then came the World Bank and the IMF and said, okay, let's put that growth strategy into a policy matrix. And now we're going to be visiting you every 6 months, and we're going to be checking the boxes in the policy matrix to see if you're abiding by that policy matrix. That puts countries in the dynamic of just checking boxes. They don't really own the goal. The attempt of going from owning the goal and trying to achieve the goal to predetermining what you're going to do to get to the goal and putting those steps that you're going to do to get to the goal in your policy matrix, so that every 6 months they can be checked whether you made or didn't make progress in that box. That destroys the whole process. That's a mannequin. That's Pinocchio, not the child, but the little toy. And I think that is incredibly destructive. I mean, it may be that what you want to really assess is if a country owns its goals. And then, for example, I will mention a country like Ethiopia, where they had a reform program called the Homegrown Economic Reform. And it's very interesting that it was called the Homegrown Economic Reform. So it's to say, this is our program, it's not your program. And we did an evaluation of how much of that program they had actually implemented, and it was quite impressive. And that document exists. Unfortunately, it was derailed by the civil war, which in itself is another way in which conditionality intervened in destabilizing things, but that's a different story. So I think that I think that in many instances, conditionality backfires. In some instances, I must say that ministers use conditionality as a bargaining chip with their own parliaments, of saying, look, we could get this money, it might go to your district, but you have to approve this for me, otherwise you don't get the money. So it might, in some instances, it facilitates some internal negotiations. But I think that if countries don't have agency, if countries don't own the goal, because typically we have these goals, but we don't really know how to get them. It's a little bit like war. You have a war plan, it lasts the first day, and then you realize that the world is not the one that you thought it was at the moment you designed the initial plan. So you have to adapt and change. And many times conditionality stops you from even thinking about that. Thinking, am I really achieving my goals? You're put in the framework, am I delivering on the conditions that we had agreed back when that I was going to deliver on? And that destroys the whole process of achieving goals.
Thank you. Yes, so we'll start with Jurman, our director.
Ricardo, it's great to see you. I don't know if you heard about it, but I'm now director of Bruegel.
I heard about it, and it was fantastic news for me.
Great.
And
it's also good news for you, because I don't have to defend the IMF with respect to your last set of comments. But you offered a bit of a defense yourself, so conditionality is not always bad. Let's agree on that one. So I wanted you to expand on two of your themes, completely unrelated. So the first one is your theme 2, which is one of the most important ones, namely that the nature of the shifting nature of energy supplies means that factor endowment-based comparative advantage could be shifting in a pretty dramatic way. And so the question is, how dramatic? So there are actually some colleagues of mine here at Bruegel, Georg Zachmann in particular, and Simone Tagliapietra, who have made a very similar point, which is, German chemical industry was created at a time when Germany's comparative advantage was based on very plentiful supplies of energy, namely coal, in their own country. And then, the first blow is you get rid of the coal, but then you can still import the oil. And now this may be the deathly blow. So the question then is, how dramatic are going to be the consequences? And so the one idea that might soften the blow a bit, which I would like you to maybe comment on, is this notion that even though we may not be able to transport energy as easily as in the past, we may be able to transport intermediate inputs that embody that energy. And so maybe it doesn't mean that the entire German chemical industry has to die. Maybe it just means that certain upstream parts of the value chain have to relocate, and then we import those. And so can you elaborate on that? And, you know, potentially, could we do one of your cool maps where you show how the sort of comparative advantage of industries shifts as a result of the, you know, along the value chain of the energy transition? And so that would be a wonderful thing to do together if you're sort of in the mood of doing cool maps like you were in the past. So that's one question. And then the other one is on the carbon credits. So as an abstract idea, it's a very powerful idea, and I'm sure this is the way to go. Could you just sort of make it a little less abstract? So the intuition is clearly that we need a form of tradable instruments so that countries that actually help preserve or suck carbon out of the atmosphere, that they are compensated for it. But how do you actually get this done, right? What are the sorts of institutions that you need? And ultimately, is it governments or private entities that are going to be both sort of receiving and paying for? So who would be in the market, and how would the market be organized? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Can you pass it to Reinhilde also? I'd like to hear from my colleague Reinhilde Vögelers.
Thanks a lot for this great lecture. So I wanted to know, to which extent will the technology markets be sufficiently open? So can you assure that these countries will have access to the green technologies and the property rights to that in case they didn't develop that themselves, in the most likely case, that they get access to this? And does the patent system guarantee enough property right access at fair conditions?
These are great questions. So we'll take these pair of questions, and I'll also throw in the one from online. So we have, if I can just remember, we have the question of supply chains, intermediate supply chains. Can you make us a cool map? We will await your email. Carbon credits, technology rights, and property access, which is really good, actually. I mean, just for me to remember how to think about that. And then online, someone says, don't people want to profit from their resources, and don't people want to control other people's resources, which I think fits into that. So that's our first round of questions, and if we have time, we'll do a second round from those of us in the room.
Great. No, these are fantastic questions. So first of all, let me remind you that Germany has been a fundamental reason why Eastern Europe has been converging. That, you know, Bratislava is now a powerhouse in the car industry, and that Romania is exporting, inputs to the electronics industry and the car industry and so on. That Germany has used its ability to coordinate production and to develop technology, to invest in value chains that are outside of Germany, and that has been, extremely positive for the growth of Europe. I would just say that, if Europe acknowledges that it's 8% of world emissions, and that 92%, involves, acting on the rest of the world. The question is there a marriage between Germany's capacity to organize production, to organize value chains, to develop the technology, to coordinate these things, is something that has important spillovers for other countries. And I think that, things are going, have the potential of moving that direction. I've seen a lot of German interest and European interest in Namibia. Namibia has the Namibian desert, which is one of the places with most sun in the world, but also sun that is combined with wind, and especially wind at night. And that means that with the same electrolyzer, you can run it more hours of the day, because you can run it at night and during the day, so your capital costs decline. You have capacity utilization of 70-some% instead of 30-some%. So just by that, your capital costs go down by half. And they are bringing in, training Namibians, and so I think possibilities of cooperation are vast, and I think that just the example of what Germany has done for the rest of Europe is a good a good example of what it could do in these areas of green energy. We're very and so, by the way, if we're going to achieve net zero, these industries are going to be multiples of what they are now. These are going to be the growth industries, right? I mean, there's a reason why Mercedes-Benz, the last time I checked, was worth something like $65 billion, and Tesla is worth $1 trillion. Mercedes-Benz produces many more cars, but not the cars that the market thinks the world is going to be buying in the future. So there's a huge growth opportunity there. And the question is, do you want to get the rest of the 92% of the world along with you in exploiting this growth opportunity so that many of these activities can happen elsewhere? I'm sure that your intellectual property, there's going to be parts of the value chain that, that Germany can keep and grow, but it's going to be in Germany's interest not to be wasting resources in moving very costly energy when it's better to use the energy where it hits. So that's we're very much into developing these cool maps. A former fellow of ours, I'm blanking on her name, a senior moment, I'll tell you in a Penny Mealy has a first version of that, but we're working on it, and we're trying to think hard about where are the opportunities for green growth and how are countries located vis-a-vis those opportunities. So which countries have sort of like an implied comparative advantage, a potential comparative advantage? For which countries this is not like too big a jump, they more or less have what it takes. It looks feasible. So we're working on that, and I'm more than happy to collaborate with you any day of the week, except on weekends, which I rather use for hiking. So secondly, on carbon credits, if you think into the future, suppose that you are a carbon emitter and you're capturing CO2, and you want to dispose of a place where you're going to store it. Where is that place? Is that going to be within your country's territorial space, or are you going to look around for a good space to store it? Who's going to be investing in the capacity to store and in the legal framework to store? So I think there's going to be a market there, and in that market there's going to be a price, and people are going to say, can I do it more cheaply? Can I do it more expensively? And then the question is, what are the rents of using this sort of like limited storage space underground, and what are the rents of being one of the few countries that have the right legal framework to do it, and the right guarantees that assures that CO2 is not going to be coming back to the atmosphere at a later date. So I think that's a market that needs developing. That's in the market of carbon capture and sequestration. But there's a lot of the Amazon that has been deforested. Can it be reforested? So we know that more or less. I think it is that a hectare of Amazon forest captures something like 20 tons of CO2 a year. Well, and if a ton of CO2 is $50, that's say $1,000 of rent per hectare, and $1,000 is more than an eighth of a cow, right? So it becomes more profitable than cattle ranching. But you need to solve several institutional problems. It can't be that you captured CO2 this year, and then you yourself or somebody else comes in and cuts the forest tomorrow, and it emits all that CO2 back to the atmosphere. So you have to have some kind of credible guarantees that CO2 that was captured is really captured. So that requires some legal framework that assures the validity of those credits. And then we want to make those credits as tradable as possible. I think it's not a market that is going to happen on its own, but I've been working on European countries that have been trying to abide by the attempt of Europe to create an electricity market. And that requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of regulation to actually have, a European electricity market, and it's difficult and so on. So I think that this is an area where we can have very positive things happening. There will be more forest in Latin America, and there will be less carbon in the atmosphere, and there might be a source of revenue for places that otherwise have worse productive opportunities. On the issue of technology, I think it is a great question. It's a little bit like the question we just went through with COVID, right? So there's this vaccine, it had some development costs, but now we want to vaccinate everybody because otherwise, the disease keeps on growing and mutating and coming back to us. So we really want to vaccinate the world. And the question is, how do we structure the incentives for technology development with the need to maximize diffusion? Now, this has always been at the core of the patent distortion, that you give monopoly rights to the owners of the patent, so that they have incentives to develop the technology, but then they price things so that the market shrinks vis-a-vis the optimum size of the market. And many people, Michele Boldrin, among others, have argued that it's best to make a fixed payment for the technology and to have much lower variable costs below that. That would get us to something that's closer to the first best. So I think that we need to think, if the goal is net zero, right? We want these technologies to diffuse as quickly as we wanted the COVID vaccine to diffuse. And so I think that we need to work on the structure of incentives for technology development. But I think it's an important area of discussion. And finally, on the natural resources. So, I come from a country that's a radical resource nationalist. And as a consequence, we used to produce 3.5 million barrels of oil a day when Chavez came to power, and now we produce 500,000 barrels of oil a day. And it's not because we ran out of oil. We have infinite reserves of oil, but we wanted to take a bigger share of the pie, and we got a big share of a minuscule pie. So if you want to manage your resources responsibly, you want to maximize the revenue that those resources can generate for your country. And to maximize that revenue, what matters is not just what share of the pie, say the price that you get, but also the quantity, okay? And the quantity depends on how much investment happens in that industry. And how much investment will happen in that industry will also depend on what is the cost of capital that anybody thinking about investing in your country, even your own private sector, is going to want to cover the risks of operating in that environment. So the riskier you make that environment, the higher is going to be the demanded return to capital, and the less is going to be the share of rent that you can extract. So what you really want to do is you want to be the most efficient place to produce that stuff, whether say it's lithium or cobalt or whatever it is. You want to be the sexiest place to produce that stuff, so that if you make an auction, people are going to bid as high a price as possible for the privilege of accessing your resources. And that's how you maximize the revenues of your country.
That is really great. I'm sorry we're going to have to cut it short. I'd hope we could do a speed round of questions, but our next speaker is here. So thank you so much for your time. Not sure whether to look at the screen or the camera to best express my appreciation. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we could totally keep going for another hour if we had it. Hope to see you back at Bruegel again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So thanks to everyone. Those of you who can stay in the room, we're going to have our, I believe, final event of the afternoon, which will be our Director Jeremy Zettelmeyer and Commissioner Gentiloni here to talk about all the important things. Thank you.